Welcome, everyone. I'm Procopius. You could say I'm the ultimate historical insider, the guy who literally wrote the book on the 6th century's greatest empire. I saw it all, the glorious victories, the shady backroom plots, and the whispered gossip in the dark palace hallways. But what we're driving into today isn't some dry, dusty history lesson. Oh no! It is, without a doubt, the greatest, most absurd, and frankly tragic workplace comedy of all time. We're talking about the most undervalued employee in human history, General Flavius Belisarius, a guy who pulled off the impossible over and over again, only to have his deeply paranoid boss steal all the credit. So, let's just jump right in and see how incredible glory is built and how easily it can be destroyed in the blink of an eye.
All right, here is our first big hook. The exact moment everything went completely off the rails. Picture this. It's the year 532 AD. Constantinople, the absolute center of the civilized world, is literally burning to the ground. The sky is choked with smoke, ash is falling like snow, and this isn't some foreign invasion. It's a massive, violent uprising called the Nika riots. You've got angry mobs in the streets burning down buildings, looting churches, and screaming for the head of Emperor Justinian. And where's the emperor? He's terrified. He's trapped in his palace, shivering under his desk, seriously packing his bags to sneak out by boat in the middle of the night. The whole mighty empire is collapsing over what basically started as a sports riot. In this desperate do-or-die moment when the clock is ticking, who do you call?
So, let's officially kick off Section 1, the beginning. An empire burns, and a hero emerges during the Nika riots.
While the boss is cowering behind locked doors, our guy steps up. Enter Flavius Belisarius, a guy barely in his 30s who basically acts as the empire's military fixer. Backed by Empress Theodora, who, by the way, absolutely refused to flee and told everyone to stand their ground, Belisarius gets the call. He doesn't have some massive, overwhelming army on hand. What he has is absolute icy discipline. He marches his elite cavalry right into the giant hippodrome where the rioters are throwing a massive victory party. And with just terrifying cold-blooded efficiency, he shuts the whole rebellion down in hours. He saved his boss's job, he saved the empire. But the cost? It was staggering. 30,000 people dead. That is the sheer, brutal price paid to secure Justinian's throne in a single afternoon. 1 in 20 people in the city, gone. Belisarius proved he was brutally effective. But how do you think his boss rewarded this absolute miracle?
Here is where the toxic corporate dynamic really kicks in. Justinian, the paranoid CEO who never leaves his safe, cozy office, immediately takes all the credit. He keeps the gold, he hoards the glory. Meanwhile, Belisarius, our brilliant, loyal employee, is immediately shipped back out into the field to do more heavy lifting with exactly 0 bonuses. You see, Justinian was smart enough to know he needed a flashy foreign victory to wash away the blood of the riots and distract everyone. So he decides, hey, let's rebuild the ancient Roman Empire. And who is he going to assign this completely impossible task to? Yep, the one guy whose loyalty and genius he can actually count on.
Moving right along to Section 2, Conquering the World on a Budget. The Vandalic War.
So the emperor wants to take North Africa back from the fierce Vandal kingdom. But, like any terrible boss obsessed with budget cuts, he sends Belisarius on what is basically a corporate retreat with 0 funding. Look at this setup. Belisarius is given just 15,000 men. 15,000 to conquer an entire kingdom across the sea on totally hostile turf against a massive Vandal army that has a huge home field advantage. How do you even survive that? Well, Belisarius relied on his elite cavalry, but more importantly, he relied on strict, unyielding discipline. He actually gathered his troops and warned them, listen, God will never grant us victory if we oppress or steal from the locals. And subhanAllah, that deep belief that true victory comes from God, combined with incredible moral discipline, was his secret weapon. It completely flipped the odds.
What happened next is honestly hard to believe. Belisarius basically speed-ran the conquest. In less than a year. By June 533, his tiny fleet sails. By September, he crushes the giant Vandal army at Adecanum. By December, he beats them again at Tricamarum, using brilliant tactics and just instantly punishing the enemy's mistakes. And by March 534, the Vandal king Gelimer completely surrenders. He conquered an entire province, basically a mini-continent filled with wealth, in 6 months, with barely any losses. It's a military masterclass that's still studied today.
Of course, when you're that good at your job and you have a massive, crushing success, your coworkers get insanely jealous. The toxic whispers start flying around Constantinople.
The office gossips are telling Justinian, hey, Belisarius is way too powerful now, he's totally going to break away and make North Africa his own kingdom. But Belisarius, he passes the ultimate loyalty test. He voluntarily sails right back to the capital, throwing away any personal ambition, and dumps all the massive treasure and the captured king right at the emperor's feet in front of everyone. His loyalty was absolute, which, let's be real, is incredibly rare in any era.
Now for Section 3, the Siege of Rome, the impossible mission of the Ostrogothic War.
But the boss is never satisfied, right? Justinian sees how easy Africa was, points at a map and says, okay, now go take back Italy and Rome from the Ostrogoths. And how many men does he give his star employee to take back the birthplace of the Roman Empire? 8,000. Literally 8,000 guys. Belisarius walks into Rome and is almost immediately surrounded by a massive Gothic army that outnumbers him 4-1. How on earth do you defend a giant city with 12 miles of walls with a skeleton crew? Well, you get creative. Belisarius turned Rome into an absolute fortress in days. He frantically rebuilt the crumbling walls, he literally vacuumed up all the food and grain from the countryside to starve the enemy, and he used his elite cavalry for these devastating, rapid hit-and-run attacks. It was psychological and physical warfare at its finest.
The Goths, on the other hand, they were like a slapstick comedy routine trying to run a siege. They built these massive, terrifying wooden siege towers, but they decided to pull them with super slow oxen. So what does Belisarius do? He just laughs and tells his archers, hey, just shoot the oxen. The oxen drop, and these giant, terrifying towers are just permanently stuck in the mud, completely useless. Plus, the Goths were absolutely terrified of Belisarius' Hunnic cavalry, who would just ambush them out of nowhere every single night. Belisarius and his tiny crew held out for a year and a day, completely breaking the back of the giant Gothic army.
And then we get this insane plot twist. The Goths realize they literally cannot beat this guy, so they offer him the deal of a lifetime. We will surrender to you. We'll give you all of Italy, but only if you crown yourself Emperor of the West. Just put yourself in his shoes for a second. Your worst enemy is handing you an empire, an absolute power. Do you say no? Belisarius, being the strategic genius he is, fakes accepting the offer just so he can walk right into their impenetrable capital, Ravenna, without spilling a single drop of blood. Once he's inside and has total control, he drops the act and declares total loyalty to Justinian. But how does Justinian react back home? Does he say thank you? No, he absolutely loses his mind with paranoia, terrified of a general who gets offered an empire and turns it down.
That brings us to Section 4, Plague and Imperial Paranoia, a biological apocalypse.
Here is our second huge hook and the darkest turn in our explainer. Just when Belisarius' military glory hits its absolute peak, divine will, Qadar, steps in. In 542 AD, the world is hit by something unimaginable, the Justinian plague. 10,000. That is not the number of soldiers lost in a massive battle. That is the number of innocent people dying every single day in Constantinople at the height of the outbreak. Life just stopped. Graveyards overflowed. Bodies were piled up in the city towers and streets. Pure terror lived in every single house, and nobody knew who was next.
Up to half of the city's entire population was just wiped off the map. It was a demographic catastrophe that we can barely wrap our heads around. And right in the middle of this total chaos and despair, Emperor Justinian himself catches the plague. The mighty empire suddenly has no clear air, and everyone is holding their breath waiting for the end. Over in the Middle East, where Belisarius was stationed, his generals start quietly whispering about what happens if the emperor dies. But then, Justinian miraculously recovers. And those little passing whispers make their way back to Empress Theodora, and that is when the real nightmare begins for our hero.
So, how was our hero rewarded for years of flawless victories and unbreakable loyalty? You'd expect the guy who brought glory to the empire to get a medal, right? Especially in a crisis. The reality? Theodora fires him with the stroke of a pen. She strips him of all his military ranks. She confiscates a massive chunk of his hard-earned wealth. She even disbands his incredibly loyal personal guard, all because of a completely imagined threat to the throne. Belisarius, the guy who literally refused an entire empire to stay loyal to his boss, is tossed onto the street like a potential traitor because of the toxic paranoia rotting the capital.
Years pass, and surprise, surprise, without the genius of Belisarius, Italy is lost again to a young, energetic Gothic king named Tutala. Justinian panics. And what does he do? He calls back the very employee he just ruined.
He sends Belisarius back to Italy, but this time, it's a total setup for failure. He gives him 4,000 totally raw, untrained recruits, zero money to pay them, and local generals who are so insubordinate they refuse to even read his memos, let alone follow his orders. He literally sent him there to fail. Maybe just to prove to his own sick ego that Belisarius wasn't some magical savior, but just a tool he could break.
The result was totally heartbreaking. Despite Belisarius's desperate, heroic attempts to save it, the great city of Rome falls to the Goths. King Totila actually orders the entire city evacuated. Just picture it. Rome, the ancient capital of the world, a city of millions, now completely silent. Nothing but cold wind blowing through empty marble columns. No animals, no people. A literal ghost town for the first time in its long history. And Belisarius is stuck in his tent, sick with fever, heartbroken, and totally undermined by his own co-workers. He's eventually recalled and stripped of his high command for the last time, sent back to fade into the shadows.
And finally, Section 5, the end. The forgotten old hero and the last ride.
We are now in the year 559 AD. Belisarius is in his 60s. He's just an old, retired guy living quietly, totally forgotten. Then suddenly, the Danube River freezes over in a bitter winter, and a massive horde of 7,000 wild Kuchergur barbarians marches directly on Constantinople. And for some mysterious reason, the city has zero troops defending it. Here is the ultimate historical irony for our third big hook. The paranoid emperor, who humiliated and stripped his greatest general of everything, is now crying under his desk again, begging the old man he ruined to save his life one last time. And Belisarius, true to his incredibly noble nature, doesn't refuse the call.
The man's genius hadn't aged a single day. He didn't have a real army. What he had were 300 of his old veteran buddies, literally a bunch of grandpas with battle scars and a few terrified civilian volunteers. His plan? He directs a literal horror movie on the battlefield. He sets a tight ambush, tells the civilians to hide in the woods and scream at the top of their lungs, and has them drag tree branches behind horses to kick up massive, towering clouds of dust. The barbarians see the huge dust clouds, hear the terrifying screaming, and think they're surrounded by a giant Roman army. They totally panic and run for their lives, defeated by a handful of grandpas pulling an absolute masterclass in deception.
He saved the capital. He saved the emperor for the 1,000th time from certain death. And his reward in the most toxic workplace in history, just 3 years after this heroic act, his name is falsely dragged into a fake assassination plot, accused of treason again, stripped of his wealth again, and disgraced for months, before finally being pardoned just in time to pass away peacefully in his bed. It's just an endless cycle of institutional ingratitude and the terrified fear of someone else's success.
I'll leave you with this profound thought, something I wrote down in my own diaries. As a believer, I see this whole story as the clearest manifestation of Qadar, of divine destiny. No matter how wise men are, no matter how brilliant Belisarius's tactics were, or how toxic and cunning Justinian's plots were, ultimately, it is the will of God that directs all affairs and decides all fates in the end. The story of Flavius Belisarius isn't just about ancient battles. It asks us a profound question that echoes through time. What is the true value of absolute loyalty in a world full of betrayal? I'll let you think about that. Thanks for joining me on this deep historical explainer, and I'll catch you next time for another incredible story from the forgotten pages of history.